Fall damage. Teaching players how to do things is an essential thing for the game to do, but for them to make confident decisions, they also need to understand the more subtle rules. This small moment covers two of those. First, it shows how far the player can fall without taking damage. Second, it introduces a bit of the game's vocabulary, how the game will communicate with them. Players often worry about taking fall damage, but they also worry about taking a step that they can't take back. So here, a welcoming crate to land on signals that dropping down is safe and it's the way forward. And when the crate breaks, it reinforces the physics simulation, and is likely the first time players will see that larger objects can be broken apart.
Pick up that can. Contextualizing tutorials, creating a story scenario in which they happen, lets us do more than just stop the game to teach players something. We get to add narrative value to the moment. Here, teaching the player how to throw objects is combined with a narrative setup that gives them a choice in how to respond. After watching the Metro cops casually abuse citizens, it felt right to put the player in a similar position next. If they had opinions on how the citizens should have reacted, now they get to express them. Playtesting showed most players either complied or refused the request to pick up the can, but some tried to avoid the confrontation entirely. Others would comply initially, then retaliate after feeling humiliated. By keeping the moment relatively constrained, in both terms of player actions and the space itself, we could generally react appropriately to whatever choice they made.
Tengamos en cuenta que, por primera vez en la historia de la especie, la inmortalidad está a nuestro alcance. Este simple hecho tiene...
Playtesting. Playtesting is a core part of how we make games. We can never fully predict how players will respond or what they'll take away from what we've built. So we test to learn and hopefully improve. During a playtest, we don't guide or talk to the player, even if they're stuck, as it's extremely unlikely that we'll be sitting there next to the player once the game ships. Our goal is for testers to forget that they're playtesting altogether and play as if they're at home. Any interruptions risk skewing the data, so we only step in if there's a bug that's blocking progress, or more rarely, if their behavior is so confusing that we need to understand what they're thinking.
Y nos asustaban las sombras que trepaban por las paredes de la caverna. Pero el instinto tiene una hermana gemela inseparable.
Espera tu turno, como todos.
El instinto se une inextricablemente a los impulsos irracionales, y hoy apreciamos su verdadera naturaleza. El instinto es consciente de su...
Early in a Half-Life game, one of our goals is to make promises to the player, giving them a sense of what to expect later on. From movies to TV shows and books, all great entertainment does this in some way, and video games are no different. The promises in a Half-Life game can take different forms. Some are simple, like offering just a glimpse of something intriguing. Others are more layered, like the interactions with Metro cops. By putting the player in a powerless position against them, we set the stage for that future moment when they can finally get to retaliate.
La reproducción. Debemos agradecer a nuestros benefactores la tregua ante esta fuerza irresistible. Han dado a un interruptor y han
The Citadel. We wanted the player's first view of City 17 to highlight the Citadel and its dominance over the city, representing the Combine's complete and total power over humanity. It also needed to serve as a clear goal. Even at the start, you can see where your journey ends. But despite its massive size, playtesters often missed it. A player's sense of depth and scale can be tricky on a computer monitor. If you've played any games in VR, you'll likely have noticed that scale feels more natural. Anyway, in this case, the Citadel's position above the player didn't help things either, which may be because FPS games train players to focus straight ahead or down at their feet. To improve the chances of players taking in the Citadel, we added birds flying towards the structure. A subtle trick we found helps guide the player's view.
Exploration. After being herded through the train station by Metro cops, we wanted to give the player a chance to explore. This plaza offered several ways to interact with citizens, Metro cops, scanners, and the city infrastructure. We aimed for these interactions to continue building the world without needing explicit tutorials, and we refined them until they worked naturally, without any real training.
considerado oportuno suprimir nuestro ciclo reproductivo. Atentamente, un ciudadano preocupado. Gracias por escribir.
Playtesting Anecdote 1. One memorable playtest reminded us that we can never be certain what players are thinking or what lessons they've taken from their experience. This tester, after playing from the start and stuck trying to open a door, spent several minutes going back and forth between the game and the keyboard settings. When we asked what they were looking for, they said they were searching for the inventory controls, thinking they could use an item they'd picked up earlier to unlock the door. While we'd seen them collect and drop several physics objects, they'd misunderstood what was happening. The tester believed that pressing the use key while holding an object moved it into an inventory because the item dropped straight down. We knew it was just gravity, but their assumption wasn't crazy. Some adventure games of that era did slide items into an invisible inventory that way. We explained there was no inventory, and the playtest continued. Later, we considered whether we needed to address this, but since no other playtesters had the same confusion, and all of our potential solutions were more heavy-handed than necessary, we decided it was an outlier that was okay to remain unaddressed. It served as a good reminder, though, of how even the most subtle, overlooked details can mislead a player.
El instinto fue nuestra madre al principio de la especie. El instinto nos mimó y protegió durante los años difíciles. Cuando no teníamos útiles, cocinábamos al fuego de una precaria esfera y nos asustaban las sombras que trepaban por las paredes. Pero el instinto... Tiene una hermana gemela inseparable, la superstición. El instinto se une inextricablemente a los impulsos irracionales y hoy apreciamos su verdadera naturaleza. El instinto es consciente de su irrelevancia y al igual que una bestia acorralada, no se rendirá sin una lucha sangrienta. El instinto desea herir de muerte a nuestra especie. El instinto crea opresores y nos ordena sublevarnos contra ellos. Según el instinto, lo desconocido es una amenaza, no una oportunidad. El instinto con astucia y en secreto nos hace involucionar y nos aleja del progreso. El instinto, por lo tanto, debe ser
ropes. One of the things we noticed in all of the reference images that we gathered for City 17 was that there were cables and wires everywhere, and that they were a large part of the high-frequency detail in view. We loved the look of these older European cities enmeshed in the haphazard web of modern life. We felt like we needed a solution for cables, ropes, and similar elements, and we wanted them to be dynamic. Our level designers were eager to create plug puzzles, and connecting a cord to each plug helped players better understand the mechanics. Early in production, we built a rope system and iterated on it throughout development. Under the hood, each rope is made of multiple segments stretched between the two endpoints, and they can move independently. Each segment acts like a spring and responds to forces in the game, such as a gentle wind or the passing of a combine gunship overhead. When rendered, each segment is shown facing the camera and is bump mapped, which is crucial for giving the ropes a realistic, rounded appearance.
Strider. This simple moment is a promise that you'll encounter this enormous thing later in the game. Even an uncomplicated scene such as this really does require a lot of playtesting and iteration because of Half-Life's goal of not taking control away from the player. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of small tweaks to ensure that as many players as possible are looking at the right place at the right time here. The street layout and the Metrocop scene are all set to guide the player's gaze, perfectly framing the Strider when it appears.
Early game exploration. Up until this plaza, the player likely hasn't had to think much about their path, as it's been clear and straightforward. But here, we wanted to encourage exploration, which meant making the way forward less obvious, which can produce a feeling of being lost or, worse, confused, as you might expect. These kinds of shifts can be tough, especially early in the game, when the player is still learning the game's guidance cues. Here, it's further complicated by force-fielded checkpoints, which allow NPC citizens to move through, but restrict the player, leading many playtesters to believe that there was a way to bypass them. Ultimately, it was extensive testing that helped us find the right visibility for the alley forward, using lighting, layout, and a wooden crate, an object players have already used as a sign they're headed in the right direction, all to subtly guide them forward.
Closed captions. During Half-Life 2 development, we were approached by folks interested in accessibility who encouraged us to go beyond the subtitle system we had built for Half-Life 1. They requested a full-featured closed captioning system to capture all game sounds, not just dialogue. This turned out to be a much tougher challenge than expected. Half-Life 2 produced a wide variety of sounds, and categorizing them for captions was crucial. Prioritization was also key. Dialogue needed to stand out, and it had to be clear who was speaking. Ambient sounds, like distant combat, were important for setting the mood in some levels, but less so if there was an enemy shooting nearby. Our level designers also often reuse sounds in different contexts, so sound might require captioning in one area, but not in another. Ultimately, every sound in the game ended up with its own caption data, formatted almost like a small version of HTML, giving us control over the visual style of each caption. As with the audio files, the caption data was too large to keep in memory, so we built an asynchronous caching system to handle it efficiently.
Siempre igual. Primero el edificio y luego toda la manzana. No tiene ninguna razón para venir aquí. No te preocupes, la encontrarán.
Physics simulation. Even though we began Half-Life 2 with a functional third-party physics simulation, it still took us years of additional work both on the simulation itself and its integration into the game until we felt like we could meet our designers' ambitions. Maintaining a shippable level of quality and performance was something we knew would be a challenge along the way, but the more subtle issue was actually figuring out what to simulate and to what extent. We can't simulate everything, and even if we could, there are game design reasons why the experience is better when we don't. In many cases, we deliberately bend the simulation to improve the player's experience. These adjustments usually go unnoticed because they align with player intentions. For example, we disable collisions between the player and large objects to let them turn in narrow spaces. Or we tweak the Combine rifle's alternate fire to gently guide the Combine ball toward enemies, making it more effective.
Crate Baby. This small baby doll has a long legacy. During the long months of internal testing, some of the team turned it into a challenge, a way to make the 47th playthrough of a game a bit more fun. They'd place the doll inside of a nearby blue crate and see how far they could carry it throughout the game. After Half-Life 2 launched, the community started carrying Crate Baby as well, adding their own stories and rules to the mix. A few years later, while working on Episode 2, this was the inspiration for the Little Rocket Man achievement, where players had to carry a garden gnome dubbed Gnome Chomsky throughout the entire episode. Chomsky even made a comeback for Left 4 Dead 2 in the Garden Gnome achievement, where players had to carry him through the Dark Carnival campaign. These kind of interactions with players are some of the most rewarding parts of game development. We design games with theories in mind, but you never really know where things are going until players get their hands on it.
Physics Simulation 2. Areas where game design or other constraints impacted the physical simulation often required extra tuning to keep the simulation from blowing up. As an example, early on we experimented with increasing the simulation on the player entity, which is to say, make player movement much more a part of the physical simulation of the world. We knew this might make movement feel less precise, but hoped it could lead to some novel experiences. However, after tuning the movement to match the less simulated version, we hit a major problem. The physical force needed for the player to move at their usual speed was so high that simply running into other simulated objects could result in death from the impact. We iterated on it, but ultimately couldn't find a solution we liked and reverted to the less simulated movement. However, this wasn't exactly the easier path. It introduced new challenges with how the less simulated player interacted with the more simulated objects in the game. But it did allow us to deliver the precise movement experience we wanted.
Playground. When we discussed ways to highlight our physics simulation around the city environment, a playground felt like the natural fit. And for players paying attention to Dr. Breen, it's also a reminder of the cost of humanity's surrender to the Combine. We chose a few playground structures with interesting physics potential and began tuning them. Even with the advanced physics simulation we had at the time, setups like this always required hand tuning, as we had fully simulated objects interacting with non- or partially simulated ones, such as the player or static world geometry. It might be easy to assume that a simulation can carry a lot of the load of implementation, but even now, 20 years later, that is rarely the case. Back when we were working on the playground, late in development on the game, we couldn't get the friction on the slide to feel right, so we decided to break the ladder so the player couldn't get up there. However, you still can just walk right up the front. As is commonly the case, you, the player, get the last laugh on us.
Muévete.
Materials and shaders. Half-Life 2 came out in the midst of a significant shift in 3D graphics, where the industry moved from textures to materials and shaders. In Half-Life 1, every surface had a texture, essentially an image wrapped onto the polygons of the surface. But by Half-Life 2, just 5 years later, every surface had both a material and a shader. The shader was a lump of code that customized how the surface was rendered. The material defined properties for how the surface behaved physically and how it responded to gameplay features. It also held references to textures and other parameters for the shader to use for rendering. As a result, artists and designers had much more control over how things looked and behaved. However, this came with a trade-off. Half-Life 1 could run on a computer with only a CPU, but Half-Life 2 required a GPU because the computations needed for materials and shaders were specifically designed for GPU hardware. The refracting glass door here is a clear example of a custom shader, but every surface in the scene is actually running a shader of some kind.
Cube maps. With the addition of materials and shaders, we needed a solution for reflective surfaces like glass and steel. These surfaces had to know what to reflect, but in 2003 we couldn't do any of that rendering in real time, so we developed the cube map system for pre-computed reflections. A cube map is a set of 6 images on the inside of a cube, capturing the environment in every direction, like a panoramic photo that surrounds you on all sides. Level designers placed invisible marker entities throughout the levels, and during map compilation, we generate a cube map at each marker. Then, during gameplay, when rendering a reflective surface, we locate the nearest pre-computed cube map to create the reflection.
Field of view. In Half-Life 1, we used a 90-degree field of view, or FOV, which was fairly standard for first-person shooters at the time. But during Half-Life 2's development, we grew unhappy with it. With our game's focus on characters, we'd put extensive effort into detailed facial and body animations, but the 90-degree FOV just didn't allow players to get close enough to fully appreciate that detail. So we began experimenting with a tighter FOV, and ultimately landed on 75 degrees. It took some adjustment for both us and players, and it required an additional FOV for view models, which are the player's weapon, held at the bottom of the screen. Their models were originally built with 90 degrees in mind, so they looked distorted at 75. But this change succeeded in doing what we wanted, putting our characters front and center in the game.
Reference maps. As our characters grew more lifelike between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2, we wanted the game world to feel equally realistic. In Half-Life 1, the limitations of first-person games often made it easier to lean on stylized or abstracted environments. But with Half-Life 2, we set out to create a setting that felt grounded in reality, which meant focusing on a lot of small details we hadn't before. One of our main steps was creating reference maps to standardize how we'd map real-world proportions into the game. These maps establish details like wall and door dimensions, doorknob heights, interior lighting, furniture scale, and the general scale of common objects. We created standardized textures for level designers, complete with scale and lighting values. The layouts would be consistent from the start. Besides setting up the physical world, these reference maps defined how the player would move through it, how high they could jump, how low they could duck, and the size of spaces like vents. Using these maps as foundation, we were able to keep our world geometry consistent and ensure realistically sized spaces across the game.
Ya no aguanto más.
Todo va a salir bien.
¿Qué vamos a hacer?
Missing material. Early on in developing our low-level graphics code, we realized it would be difficult to spot polygons that weren't rendering due to a missing texture. When this happens, you typically just see black where the polygon should be, which could easily go unnoticed in darker scenes. To catch this bug more reliably, we created an error texture that would be visually unmistakable and generated automatically whenever a texture failed to load. This gave rise to the now iconic purple and black checkerboard texture, which has since taken on a life of its own well beyond Half-Life 2.
Cuidado, ¿vale? ¡Ya es suficiente! ¡Para!
The raid. The section ahead, where the Metro cops raid the apartment while the player is inside, took a lot of iteration to get right. Generally, we design Half-Life to let players set their own pace, since people move through the game in a variety of ways. Some players run, ignoring anything that doesn't seem like a threat, while others methodically poke at everything. So, whenever we need to force a specific pace, it's always a challenge to ensure players perceive that pace and naturally play along. Since this is the first time we do this, we had to put in a lot of work to make it clear to the player that they needed to move quickly, and there's no time for exploration here.
The Raid 2. In addition to making sure the player felt the pressure to move forward, we had to ensure the raid itself was foolproof. There couldn't be any way for the player to avoid it or double back past the Metro cop. The real challenge wasn't that players would try to break the scene, but that many would panic and run in random directions once they realized they were under threat for the first time. This moment requires a delicate balance. We wanted a heart-pounding escape, the sense of real danger, but we wanted players to
Health and no HUD. The rooftop chase sequence posed a unique design challenge. We didn't want it to be a true gameplay obstacle, and our best case was for players to make it through on their first try. But we still wanted to create the sense of real danger, where players felt legitimately threatened if they didn't keep moving. The challenge was that without the HEV suit, players don't technically have a heads-up display or HUD, which means no way to show damage or remaining health. After some experimenting, we created a special health system for this section, using a red glow around the screen to indicate damage. Players reacted as we hoped, taking it as a sign to keep moving, and the chase unfolded as intended. To top it off, we made health regenerate quickly so the glow wouldn't linger, reinforcing to players that running was indeed the right choice, and ensuring players weren't taken down by a stray bullet at the end just because they dawdled or hesitated earlier on.
Playtesting Anecdote 2. In the upcoming section, we needed the player to be knocked down so Alex could save them. With limited time and resources, we simplified the encounter as much as possible, reusing existing systems and letting it play out like a normal combat sequence, with a custom event triggered when the player died. After a few playtests to fine-tune the timing, we moved on. But as we got close to shipping, we encountered a problem with a playtester who quick-saved constantly and immediately hit quick load whenever they thought they'd failed. When a Metro cop hit them, they quick loaded before Alex could step in, repeating this more than 10 times before we asked them to stop. At this stage of development, in the final bug-fixing phase, we had to limit ourselves to fixing only game-breaking issues, since even small changes could risk breaking something more important. Knowing this was a rare edge case, because most players had no trouble, we made a few conservative changes. We shortened the delay between the knockdown and Alex's first line and changed the fade-out color to white instead of black, which wasn't ultimately that useful since players hadn't died enough yet to associate black with death. We considered disabling quick load for the few seconds that the scene plays out, but we were worried that could introduce a bug where quick load became disabled permanently.
¡Aquí! ¡Ja! En absoluto. El doctor Freeman, supongo. Vamos, rápido. La alianza tarda en despertar, pero cuando lo hace, mejor quitarse de en medio.
Alex. Nailing Alex's design was a big challenge. We wanted the player to both respect and care for her. Saving Eli was a key player goal midway through the game, and we knew that getting players to care about that goal would be easier if they also cared about Alex and her relationship with her father. We intentionally designed, wrote dialogue, and cast a voice actor for Alex to be savvy, capable, and relatable within the Combine-controlled world, while also making her attractive and charismatic. We aimed to avoid the objectification, exaggeration, and hypersexuality that many games of the 2000s featured, as we felt that would undermine our goals for her character.
Por aquí, Gordon. Soy Alex Vance. Mi padre trabajó con usted en Black Mesa, pero seguro que no me recuerda. Hombre de pocas palabras, ¿eh?
NPCs on elevators. We often spend a significant amount of time solving problems that players might not even notice. Many of these are subtle design challenges, while others stem from multiple systems interacting with each other. For example, getting non-player characters to ride in elevators posed a complex problem because it involved various systems, NPC AI decision-making, navigation planning, and movement simulation, to name a few. Additionally, the elevator itself had its own simulation requirements unrelated to NPCs. One of the more subtle challenges came from the fact that we simulate NPCs at a slower rate than we simulate elevators. This meant that NPCs on a descending elevator would simulate to make sure they were properly standing on the elevator, and then the elevator would simulate a few times, each time moving further down the elevator shaft, subtly leaving the NPC behind. Shortly after that, the NPC would simulate a second time and pop itself down on the elevator floor once again. You can imagine that it was hard to take Alex seriously when she was constantly falling down in small increments while talking to you.
Interactive storytelling. When we started on Half-Life 2, storytelling in games was generally either high fidelity and linear or low fidelity and interactive. We knew players had seen high-quality storytelling in games, but they'd never been placed right in the middle of it, able to watch it unfold around them, interact with it, and examine any part closely. While that goal excited us, we didn't yet know how it would work or what kind of technology we'd need to make it happen. We had built a variety of storytelling technology in Half-Life 1, but it was mostly presented in front of the player and lacked the interactivity and fidelity we were aiming for. So Kleiner's Lab became the section of the game we used as a testbed to figure out how our interactive storytelling would actually function.
Qué curioso que se presente justo hoy.
Kleiner's Lab. Kleiner's Lab was the first piece of storytelling we worked on, and the one that took the longest to figure out. In addition to its role in launching the player into the game, it eventually became the unifying vision for the development team in terms of storytelling. As we began building our characters and narrative delivery around the player, many questions arose, all of which felt like major risks for the game. Would players be able to extract the important information from the scene? Could we get them to care about these characters? How would we support players with varying levels of investment in the story? How costly would it be to produce a scene like this? And how many more would we need? These and many more were questions we couldn't answer until we'd built enough of the scene and tested it with a lot of playtesters. Frustratingly, unlike many other problems we face, these weren't questions we could confidently answer until we had done significant work. We can often test gameplay ideas with low-fidelity prototypes, but if a player isn't invested in our storytelling when the characters are just gray blocks, how confident can we be that they'll care once the characters are fully realized.
Choreography. The system we built and iterated on to deliver Half-Life 2's storytelling was internally called choreo, short for choreography. Early on, we found it useful to imagine we were writing a play where one of the actors didn't know the script. We needed a system that could control all the other actors, moving them around the stage, delivering their performances and speaking their lines. To handle this, the other actors would need to seamlessly mix our directorial commands with dynamic responses to the player's position and behavior. Timing was clearly going to be a major challenge, as any part of the scene might need to lengthen, contract, or even pause, depending on what the player was doing.
¿Qué tal un trago?
FacePoser. The primary tool we built to power the choreo system was called FacePoser, an inaccurately named program that allowed our animators to lay out the entire structure of our scenes along a timeline. The timeline contained a series of choreo commands for the actors, along with all the necessary information for them to perform those commands. By layering these commands on the timeline, animators could easily describe how an actor might need to face one thing while talking towards another and walk to a different location, all at the same time. But the timeline wasn't a fixed linear sequence. Actors would follow their commands, but they had to respond dynamically to the world around them. An actor might take longer to move to a location if the player is in the way, or they might need to wait to deliver a line because another actor has been delayed by the player. FacePoser allowed us to rapidly iterate on scenes, trying different layouts, dialogue deliveries, and timings. This ability to quickly experiment and adjust proved critical in finding the right performances to achieve our character and narrative goals. Choreo commands. This debug visualization shows the two most common choreo commands actors receive throughout a scene, internally known as look-ats and move-tos. Actors are given targets to look at, sometimes more than one at a time, and then try to focus on the one that makes the most sense given their current state. At the same time, they might be receiving move-to commands, which tell them to move to a location and face a specific direction or object. Even these seemingly simple commands involved a lot of complexity. A scene might require an actor to talk while typing on a keyboard, all while looking at an object the player is holding. Since we couldn't predict where the player would be during playback, authoring scenes like this required us to break each element of the scene into separate pieces and layers. These could then be reassembled as needed during playback, based on the player's actions and interrupted if necessary.
No puede quedarse mucho tiempo. Pondrá en peligro todo nuestro trabajo.
No te preocupes, viene conmigo.
Exacto, Barney. Hoy es un día memorable. Vamos a estrenar el teletransportador con una doble transmisión.
¿Entonces funciona? ¿En serio esta vez? Porque todavía tengo pesadillas con ese gato.
Venga, no hay razón para estar nerviosos. Hemos progresado mucho desde entonces. Grandes progresos.
¿Qué gato?
Ya que no va a salir, mejor que deje el atuendo de paisano.
¿Qué? Dios, es verdad. Casi lo olvido. Barney, te cedo el honor.
Tengo que volver al trabajo. Pero vale. ¡Allá vamos! ¡Uah! ¡Maldita sea! ¡Quítamelo!
¡Lamar! ¡Ahí estás!
¿No te habías librado de esa peste?
Por supuesto que no. Sin miedo, Gordon. No tiene pinzas y es totalmente inofensiva. Lo peor que te haría es intentar aparearse con tu cabeza. En vano, en vano.
¡Quítamelo de encima!
Aquí, bonita. ¡Salta! ¡No! ¡No tan arriba! ¡No! ¡No! ¡Cuidado, Lamar! ¡Son muy frágiles! ¡Oh, no! Tardaré otra semana en sacarla de allí.
Sí. Más si tenemos suerte.
Barney, ¿no te gustan los animales?
Gordon, adelante. Ahora ponte el traje.
Writing. In the Half-Life 1 era, player goals in FPS games were still largely about fighting and defeating an obviously evil enemy. It was hard to get players to care about characters when they were as low fidelity as they were in Half-Life 1. With the planned improvements in character fidelity for Half-Life 2, we wanted to take a shot at making characters the driving force of the narrative. Our goal was for the player's motivations to align with those of our characters, for the player to care about these people, their hopes and fears, and to want them to succeed. With this in mind, we were able to assemble our approach to character and dialogue. We would create a set of characters who liked and cared about each other, hoping that the player would feel the same. These characters would interact in a way that felt inclusive, like a group of old friends who see the player as one of them, just someone who's been away for a while. If the characters demonstrated realistic emotional connections with each other, we believed we could build an emotional connection with the player as well.
Delivery. It took a lot of iteration and playtesting to strike the right balance of information and emotional connection in our major choreo scenes. Each scene had a lot of information we needed to convey to the player, but we couldn't just have characters spouting exposition. Players would start thinking of them more as signposts than as people. We needed to take the time to let the characters interact with each other, allowing the player to observe the relationships. At the same time, we had to expand upon the world, giving the player a sense of everything that had happened while they were gone. All this had to be done carefully, without taking too long. We wanted the game to work for players who were less invested in the narrative. Animation became a powerful tool in communicating the emotional connections between characters, often conveying the depth of a moment quickly without overstating it. Humor was another commonly used tool, helping to puncture a setup and disarm the player when things got a bit too heavy.
Voice actors. To create more responsive and multidimensional characters in Half-Life 2, we needed to evolve our approach to working with voice actors. While running through a script with a modicum of direction was sufficient for much of the NPC dialogue for Half-Life 1, for Half-Life 2 we decided to give the actors more of an opportunity to be involved in helping to define the characters and bring them to life. We provided much more story context to the actors, showing them the game world, the environments their characters inhabited, and the other characters they interacted with. We sought actors who could take all that information and synthesize it into their performances to elevate their characters beyond what we had imagined. We held multiple sessions with the main actors, allowing them to digest and build upon their characters over time. For scenes where characters are interacting with each other, we'd often cue an actor with performances from other actors in the scene to create a better sense of connection and flow. Though we'd arrive at the studio with a script and a plan for the recording session, we made sure that the actors felt empowered and had the space to bring their own ideas to the character and performances. Having animators attend the voiceover sessions also proved critical, as they were responsible for stitching the characters' dialogue together with physical actions and expressions to form the resulting choreo scene. Often, animators found that their plans for how a scene would play out evolved quite a bit after working with the voice actor.
Bueno, Gordon, el traje de protección te sigue quedando como un guante. Al menos los guantes sí. He hecho algunas modificaciones, pero solo te explicaré lo esencial. Bien, veamos. El traje de protección Mark V se ha rediseñado para un mejor uso y comodidad. Vaya por Dios.
Vamos, no hay tiempo para esto. Al menos reabastece el traje, Gordon.
Buena idea. Hay un cargador en el muro. He modificado el traje para que absorba la energía de las tomas de corriente de la Alianza. Abundan en las zonas que vigilan.
Entre tanto, empecemos la función. Bueno, vamos, el Dr. Kleiner espera.
Character reactions. Figuring out what characters should react to and how was an ongoing challenge. At the core, we always want the game to respond to player input. However, any response from the game can be seen as a reward by the player. So, what characters react to and what they ignore teaches the player about the kind of input the game expects. As a result, we made sure to respond to things we wanted more of, like players tinkering with devices in the lab, and ignored behaviors we wanted less of, like players repeatedly slapping Clanner in the face with a box over and over again. Seriously, we watched a playtester do it for 5 minutes straight.
Por aquí, Gordon.
Gordon, ¿te importa colocarte junto al panel de allí y esperar a mis acciones?
Isaac, ¿estás ahí?
Sí, Ellie, esto va un poco lento. ¿A que no sabes quién ha aparecido en el laboratorio esta mañana?
No es quien pienso, ¿verdad?
Así es, nuestra intención es enviarle directamente junto con tu adorable hija.
¿Estás listo, papá?
Todo listo por aquí.
Pues adelante.
A ver, el flujo de campos sin masa debe limitarse. He creado la variedad en la base CYLG, la conexa, incluido el espacio de Hilbert. Las condiciones no podrían ser mejores.
Eso dijiste la última vez.
¡Ey, sí, sobre ese gato!
Iniciando en 3, 2, 1... ¡Vaya puñetas! ¿Y ahora qué?
Doctor, el enchufe.
¡Ay, Dios! Tiene razón. Gordon, ¿puedes activarnos? Excelente.
¿Que accione Gordon el interruptor?
Gordon, sigue recto. Dale al interruptor, Gordon. Muy bien. Secuencia final. Iniciando ahora.
No puedo mirar.
Vale.
Bueno, ¿ha funcionado?
Míralo tú mismo.
Doctor.
Gracias a Dios. ¡Qué alivio más grande!
Buen trabajo, Isaac.
El mérito no es todo mío. El Dr. Freeman ha demostrado ser un ayudante muy eficiente.
Ahora traigamos a Gordon.
Tiene razón. Hablamos de nuevo dentro de un momento.
Buen trabajo, Gordon. Le has dado al interruptor. Veo que tus años en MIT han valido la pena.
Entendido, Barney. Te toca.
Hey, gracias.
Gordon, en cuanto estés en posición, enviaremos con Ellie.
Que ya va siendo hora.
Excelente. Iniciando en 3, 2, 1. Barney, ¿te importaría?
Suerte ahí fuera, Gordon.
Pues sí, preparados para la proyección, Gordon. Bon voyage, te deseo lo mejor en tus futuras misiones. Secuencia final.
¿Qué diablos?
¿Qué ocurre?
¡Es tu mascota el asaltacabezas!
¡La mar! ¡Heyyy!
¡Cuidado!
¡Ahí está! ¡Está la mar con él! ¡Olvídate de eso!
Ya llega, papá.
¿Qué pasa, Judith?
No sé, parece haber algún tipo de interferencia.
Gordon, no te muevas. Te sacaremos de ahí.
Algo le está alejando.
¿Qué significa eso? ¿Quién es usted? ¿Cómo ha entrado aquí?
¡Ey! ¡Ha vuelto! Voy a sacarlo de ahí.
¡No puedes lanzarte al campo sin más! ¡Acabarías muerto!
Hemos perdido a Gordon. ¿Qué pasa?
¡Ni idea! ¡Hay una interferencia inesperada!
No te preocupes, Gordon.
Ahí está.
Le perdemos de nuevo.
El hombre al que vi, estoy seguro de que era Gordon Freeman. No ha podido pasar.
Entonces, ¿dónde está?
Detrás de ti.
¡Ah!
¡Apágalo! ¡Apágalo!
¡Gordon! ¡Tienes que salir de aquí! ¡Corre!
¡Abajo, que no te vean! Iré a buscarte. ¡Hey, Gordon! La ciudadela está en alerta máxima. Nunca la he visto tan iluminada. Sal de Ciudad 17 tan rápido como puedas, Gordon. Por los viejos canales llegarás al laboratorio de Ellie. Es un camino peligroso, pero hay toda una red de refugiados y te ayudarán si pueden. Iría contigo, pero debo cuidar al Dr. Kleiner. Ah, y ahora que me acuerdo, creo que olvidaste esto en Black Mesa. Suelta ahí fuera, colega. La necesitarás.
Phonium extraction. Another critical tool we built into FacePoser was the phonium editor. It processed the voice actors' dialogue lines and extracted phoniums to generate basic lip sync animations for our characters. For the hero characters, our animators use this as a starting point to create high-quality custom animations for each dialogue line, incorporating full facial animation. However, in a dynamic choreo scene, the animators wouldn't know exactly what the rest of the actor's body would be doing. This meant it required careful layering of choreo commands and timings in FacePoser, while still maintaining the actor's ability to dynamically respond to the player.
At the time of Half-Life 2's release, most first-person shooters gave the player a gun or a melee weapon right off the bat, but we opted to start them empty-handed. Without a weapon, it was easier to train the player on the more novel ways they're able to interact with the world and introduce them to our story. We wanted the player to transition from fugitive to the aggressor, and arming them at the right time created that moment naturally. By the time they finally get a weapon, they're done running away. They say sometimes the best way to win is to walk away, but we all know that's not true. The best way to win is to run towards something while shooting at it.
Allá va. Ahí está. Uno más peligroso.
Metro Cop Scene. This is another scene designed to make it clear that the Metro Cops are the bad guys, except this time the player has a weapon and can finally do something about it. That something comes out of the barrel of a gun. We knew we needed the player to feel righteous, and this moment was part of creating that. The Metro Cops are still human, unlike the rest of the Combine in the game, so we felt like we had to go the extra mile in making sure the player's actions felt like justice and not just wrath.
identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente.
Señal de equipo de protección perdida. Razón 5.
Atención, intruso no identificado.
Santos, contengan.
Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan a interroguen. Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. En esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen.
Droga, 8, derribada en localización 2.
Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en Con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, equipo de protección. Evacuación en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente.
Atención.
Intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente.
Iterative passes. Some chapters of the game, such as the on-foot sections of the canals in Ravenholm, were developed in multiple passes by different cabals. We found that handing off maps in this way led to greater variety in the experience, and a higher density of interesting moments, as each cabal added their unique touches to the maps. In the on-foot portion of the canals, the first pass established the art direction and the player path, along with the broad strokes of the experience and some major beats. But the team-wide alpha playtest identified insufficient tension and a somewhat monotonous experience here. In our second pass, we returned to the map solely focused on creating that tension and greatly increased the density of moment-to-moment scenarios.
En esta comunidad, respondan a interrogan.
Dios mío. Esas sirenas son por ti, ¿no? Menos mal que nos viste. No eres el primero que llega aquí por...
Este es Freeman. Ha llegado el día del juicio final para la Alianza.
Mira, nosotros vigilamos el ferrocarril subterráneo. La estación principal está en la esquina. Te ayudarán a empezar con buen pie. De momento, deja que mi Burtigón te ponga un poco las pilas.
Ten cuidado. Como nos vea, estamos muertos.
Si Protección Civil te pilla aquí, se armará la gorda en todo.
Atención, equipo de protección, estado de evasión en progreso en esta comunidad. Respondan, aíslen, interroguen. Atención. A todos los ciudadanos, la inactividad es la conspiración. Denuncien conductas inadecuadas a Protección Civil inmediatamente. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente. Atención, intruso no identificado. Confirme su estado civil con el equipo de protección local inmediatamente.
¡Aquí! ¡Ayuda!
Atención comunidad. Código. Código, presión, espada, esterilicen.
Bioseñal de equipo de protección perdida. Rodilla una vez.
Alerta, equipo de protección. Pruebas de actividad anticivil en esta comunidad. Código, reúnanse, inmovilicen, contengan. Alerta, equipo de protección. Pruebas de actividad anticivil en esta comunidad. Código, reúnanse, inmovilicen, contengan.
Estación 12, adelante.
Aquí, estación 8. Han tomado la estación 12. Las unidades de ataque van a por las estaciones de tren. Repito, Protección Civil va hacia las estaciones subterráneas. Tenemos refugiados de la 9 y periferia. Parece que...
Estación 8, ¿me recibís? Estación 8, ¿estáis ahí? Nos han confirmado la presencia de robosierras. Repito, el subsuelo está lleno de robosierras.
Despejado, código 100. Línea 3, montar barrera.
Atención, el comportamiento de la unidad de incumplimiento es de evasión constante. Equipo de protección de tierra. Alerta, código. A todos los Esterilicen. Atención comunidad. Código de procedimiento de males activado. Código inoculen, protejan, pacifiquen. Código presión, espada, esterilicen. Atención comunidad. Código de procedimiento de malestar activado. Código inoculen, protejan, pacifiquen. Código presión, espada, esterilicen. Atención, el comportamiento del acusado de incumplimiento es de evasión constante. Equipo de protección de tierra, alerta. Ayuden, pongan, administren. Alerta, equipo de protección. Seguridad civil en esta comunidad. Código, reúnanse, inmovilicen, contengan.
Sigue adelante. Asaltaron esa estación, pero hay otras más adelante. Me quedo por si vienen otros. Hay que mantener el ferrocarril.
Nivel 2. Se le acusa de actividad anticivil. Nivel 1.
Detectando una señal en 640. Controlado. Detecto la señal 647 de la vigilancia local. Ni 647 ni 10107. Entendido. No tiene aviso de no intruso. 10 intrusos. Cuidado. A sospechoso.
Equipo de protección perdida.
Social. Reciba su veredicto. Atención ocupantes. El buque se encuentra ahora ahora se le acusa de puesta en peligro social. Nivel 5. Interrumpa la evasión inmediatamente. Reciba su veredicto.
Refuerzos código 3. A la barricada. Continúa.
de tránsito 1.
Atención comunidad. Código de procedimiento de malestar activado. Código inoculen, protejan, pacifiquen. Código presión, espada, esterilicen. Individuo, se le acusa de incumplimiento de solicitud civil. Nivel 2. Se le acusa de actividad anticivil. Nivel 1. Unidades de protección. Código de persecución. Deber, espada, operación. Alerta. Unidades de protección. Estructura de malestar local detectada. Reúnanse, administren, pacifiquen. Alerta, unidades de protección de tierra. Estructura de malestar local detectada. Reúnanse, administren, pacifiquen. El bloque se encuentra ahora bajo coacción inactiva permisiva. Se han descontado 5 unidades de racionamiento. Individuo, ahora se le acusa de fuerza en peligro social. Nivel 5. Interrumpa la evasión inmediatamente. Reciba su veredicto. Código de procedimiento de malestar activado. Código inoculen, protejan, pacifiquen. Código presión, espada, esterilicen. Tipo de protección de tierra. El juicio autónomo está ahora personal. Sentencia es discrecional. Código aputen 0, confirmen. Alerta, equipo de protección. Pruebas de actividad anticivil en esta comunidad. Código, reúnanse, inmovilicen, contengan. Atención comunidad. Código de procedimiento de malestar activado. Código, inoculen, prote.
las vías para que no nos sigan. Creo que vas a ser el último en pasar. Tienes suerte de no ser al que busca. El pobre no tiene posibilidades. Protección civil. Ahora están invadiendo todo con robosierras. Será mejor pirarse antes de que lleguen.
¡Mierda! Demasiado tarde.
Por los pelos. Gracias por tu ayuda. Oye, este no es un lugar seguro. La misión es para que puedas ir y luego salpitando. ¡Buena suerte!
Equipos de protección de tierra. La renuncia a juicio está ahora vigente. La persecución capital es discrecional. Atención, unidades de tierra. Han sido en esta comunidad. Código bloque cauterice. La renuncia a juicio está ahora vigente. La persecución capital es discrecional. Individuo se le acusa de incumplimiento capital. Estado de anticiudadano aprobado. Atención ocupantes. El bloque se encuentra ahora bajo coacción inactiva permisiva.
Golpe. 8. Unidad muerta. Unidades restantes contengan.
implícita revocada.
Bioseñal de equipo de protección perdida.
Espada, esterilicen. Individuo, ahora se le acusa de busca y peligro social. Nivel 5. Intenta evacuar inmediatamente. Reciba su beneficio.
Confirmar.
Bloque tránsito 1.
Atención ocupante. El bloque se encuentra ahora bajo coacción inactiva permisiva. Se han descontado 5 unidades de racionamiento. Individuo, se le declara culpable de varias infracciones anticiviles, ciudadanía pública revocada. Código bloqueo
Detectadas laceraciones pequeñas. Precaución. Signos de daños críticos. Cuidados médicos necesarios.
Ciudadanía implícita revocada. Estado marino. Se declara culpable de varias infracciones anticiviles. Ciudadanía implícita revocada. Estado marino. Atención, comunidades denunciado en esta comunidad. Código bloqueo cauterice.
What?